I'm at the University of Texas Health Science Centers at San Antonio, or now they call themselves UT Health San Antonio. I'm a professor, division director of immunology and pediatric immunology and infectious disease. But I see adults and children, mostly immunologic disease, allergic disease, asthma, respiratory disease.
Okay, so respiratory allergies, right. Um, so can you go over a little bit of the effects of living near uh, oil pads or production sites, especially if they're leaking, say, methane and some of the other um, chemicals into the air?
Right, right. Well, I'm not directly impacted because I live in San
Sure, sure,
Antonio.
sure.
Um, but from what I know, from what I've read, and reported on previously, so at exploration sites or drilling sites, it seems that in order of importance, I think the hydrogen sulfide gas is likely the most important pollutant. Um, and I actually recently had a patient who worked in that area, and he verified that yes, it's a toxic environment. Two is also a byproduct, but those are the sort of the main ones in production areas. My
Okay.
understanding.
Okay. So SO2, when people talk about the smell around these sites, when they talk about that rotten egg odor, am I correct in
Mhm.
saying that that's probably the SO2 or other sulfides?
It's usually the H2S, the in that
H2S.
environment. Yeah, high concentration of SO2 will give you a similar smell, but in that environment, more than likely it's the hydrogen sulfide gas,
Okay. Um,
swamp gas, or sewer gas, or whatever you want to call it.
right, right. But it's that sour sulfur rotten egg smell that
Exactly.
hits when you
Yeah.
drive past these sites. And
Yeah.
so we have some of these sites that are going up where, we've got drilling stations within, say, a half-mile school. But what would you expect to see the long-term impact of, we've got these young kids at schools who are right next to these
Hmm.
sites. What would be the impact that you would expect or be concerned about?
Well, SO2 has been fairly well studied, and it's an airway irritant and high concentrations, eye watering, etc. And respiratory illness for long-term exposure is probably the biggest risk. And in combination with the other co-pollutants, and again, refineries versus uh, drilling platforms is quite a bit different as far as the mix. And so we worry most about refineries, and that's what I've studied a lot. And
Sure.
I used to be in Galveston, so we studied the refineries in Houston and Texas City. But um, the H2 gas, has been reported to cause some developmental problems in high concentrations. So um, that would be a major concern if the levels are high enough. And acute exposures, the acute respiratory illness, et cetera. But the long-term exposures to SO2 more biasing into the respiratory illnesses and airway irritation and worsening of asthma, and the H2S probably developmental problems. And people don't. I guess they get used to it, the people that work around it, but if you smell it, if you've ever smelled it, you're being exposed to it. So you do have some kind of internal alarm there. But even below the smell level, people have reported some health effects from chronic exposure to H2S. And these studies were done in California many years ago.
Okay. Switching to refineries, since it sounds like that is more of your area of expertise. So
Yeah.
like Baytown area, we've had reports, people saying, my kids have chronic headaches, they've got chronic nosebleeds, and anecdotally, they say that these symptoms get worse during high flaring times. Um, could you talk about some of those impacts from the flaring and from the refineries?
Well, flaring is actually, indirectly a good thing, right? It burns off the most toxic agents. And so I don't know about specific flaring events. Obviously, you get production of combusted products such as oxides of nitrogen, and that may increase the ozone and other co-pollutants at that time. The airway irritation certainly can result from multiple different contaminants coming from petrochemical refineries. And then there's more subtle effects such as benzene, which increases the risk of leukemia. And as the toxicologists will say, it's a lifetime exposure. In other words, it's just clear opening the doors and windows. You help it. Well, not if it's high outside, but you clear it out, but you've been exposed to that, so it's accumulative. So if you live in an area your whole life, and a lot of low income areas around refineries, people don't have a whole lot of choices with their income levels and low income housing in those areas. Get a lifetime exposure, and this has been shown over in multiple studies. The closer you live to a petrochemical plant, the higher the rates of leukemia and lymphoma.
So this would kind of go back to Cancer Alley in Louisiana and some of the other clusters that we're seeing.
Yeah, along the Houston Ship Channel, it was named the Leukemia Belt many years ago. A study by the UT School of Public Health back in the 70s identified this.
So go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, I was going to say, and even though the refineries over the years have improved, it appears in the ambient levels of benzene in the Houston Ship Channel area are reduced overall. They're still elevated above ambient, and so they still contribute to a lifetime exposure to things like benzene.
So we are still seeing increased rates of leukemia in these areas.
I haven't seen a recent study, to be honest.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people haven't identified or gotten funding to do that study in the Houston area, but there's studies all around the world that show the same thing. So it's a pretty consistent relationship.
Okay. There was also a recent story, I believe it was in the Houston Chronicle, showing reduced life expectancies, especially in the elderly around refineries and drill sites, as well as increased rates of birth defects, miscarriages, etc. Are you familiar with that? Are you seeing any of that in the research?
I'm not familiar with the specific study they're quoting, but there's these kinds of studies are very difficult to do because, again, the people that live it's an environmental justice issue, right?
Right.
The rents are low. I remember in Texas City, there were a string of parks, public parks and public housing within the several blocks of the refineries. So all the comorbidities of lower SES or persons of color, et cetera, all those disparities, come out in those populations. So it's very hard to control for those factors versus is it an environmental issue directly? So it's always difficult to ascribe in an individual, even in the midst of a flare or an event, if you will, at a refinery, and then somebody has symptoms that are consistent with what you would expect from the different mix of pollutants coming out. It's still virtually impossible to ascribe directly unless you're being monitored and a
Right.
whole lot of things are being done to basically prove your personal exposure to XYZ pollutants. And even then it's difficult because, for instance, in asthma, the main trigger of asthma are respiratory viruses. So that's what puts kids in the hospital. Even allergies are less potent at flaring up severe asthma and having an exacerbation of asthma. So you take that baseline, it's viral infections. And so some studies have shown that oxide of nitrogen, high level of oxide of nitrogen, increase the rate and the severity of the respiratory infections and, asthma exacerbations as a result. So it's like it has this sort of additive effect. And so if you're constantly exposed to airway irritants that, at a low level may produce respiratory problems that might be negligible as far as coming to your attention. Put on top of that one of these respiratory viruses, like they're talking about, in the news with RSV and these other. We've had a really dramatic virus season since the shutdown. I think the other viruses are angry and they've come back with a vengeance. But that's where you start seeing the, bona fide health effects. And again, it's sort of an additive effect. And that's where the studies are, if they're careful, they can identify the increased morbidity as a result of exposures.
Okay. So, and I apologize, it's been a long time since I took stats, but we're talking about the multivariate analysis, basically showing the cumulative effects. Okay.
Right.
Okay, great.
And I've always used a seat of the pants estimate of the impact of air pollutants on respiratory disease in the ballpark of about 10% of the morbidity.
Okay.
And that's a really rough figure, but just looking at multiple studies and, kind of seeing this my whole career, that I think that's a general reasonable term to say it's adding to, and then you throw in all the other junk because many things flare up or exacerbate asthma, smoking in the home and, allergies and things of that nature. So trying to ascribe the multiplicative effect of all of these environmental factors gets a little tricky. But there's no doubt, when we do controlled studies, like with animal studies, et cetera, or human studies in which they really do good air quality modeling, where they can either ascribe a level of pollutant at a person's home or playground or school, there's no doubt that there's an impact. And the closer you are, and a lot of studies have looked at how far you are from a major highway, because the fine particulates and the toxics that come from highways. And, the closer you get to a major highway, the worse the respiratory illness is.
What would you say to the people? I was in Odessa recently, and one of the things I heard was, well, I've been living here for 50 years and it's never bothered me. So what would be your response to people saying, well, I'm okay, so obviously there's not a problem?
Yeah, I mean, as I said, so we did a study in Galveston with beach lifeguards, very healthy, and they did a pretty vigorous exercise routine, and we measured their lung function every day over 3 summers. That's when they worked. And, the air quality in Galveston is usually pretty good. And we found, we were focused on, all the criteria pollutants and a local monitoring site. So it's a very, if you will, not a direct exposure, but every time the fine particulates would increase, we saw a very subtle but consistent reduction in lung function in these healthy young kids. And no, they don't experience any obvious thing. We didn't interview them to find on this day, did you feel worse when you're doing your workout? But it was very, very consistent. And a lot of studies show this decrement in lung function that might not be noticeable over even a long term. And, for instance, I tell people, well, when you're just sitting around watching TV, you probably use 10% of your lung function. If you're a long distance runner, that's a little bit different. You're using quite a bit of your lung function, and you may notice more effect. So going back to your person that says, I've never had any problems. Well, let's measure him.
Right.
Let's, do we have data on him that, there really is no effect? And, again, adding these comorbidities is really the secret. People who develop COPD that never smoked, what is it? Well, it's most likely the exposure to indoor-outdoor air pollutants. And so, and not everyone develops COPD. And again, it's hard to ascribe it directly to one individual. And so I discount those and say, well, that's fine.
Right.
It's not scientific. It's just anecdotal.
Okay, cool. Yeah. So another thing that I heard in that trip, it was a committee hearing about energy, specifically around methane flaring and releases and leaks and that sort of thing, where a hospital administrator said, but he claimed that there were no real breathing issues in the area. and that, well, it's nothing compared to, say, diabetes, and they don't see increases during high production events or during a boom or in boom bust cycles, that they're not seeing increases of breathing issues
Mhm.
when production goes up. Would that surprise you?
No, no. I mean, again, it's very anecdotal.
Okay.
He's not collecting data on how often a kid coughs or how often they, you know, take an absence because of a respiratory illness. And um, no, I mean, it doesn't mean anything. People, again, just people's general impression often doesn't count for much. And unfortunately, the same goes for some individuals who smell, let's say H2S, which is a very low threshold for a smell, and immediately ascribe whatever symptom they're having to that smell
Mhm.
or to a visual stimulus like the plants flaring. I worry more about when the flares aren't working because that's a much more dangerous situation from a standpoint of air quality. So I just don't, it's nice to get people's opinion about it, but it's really an opinion. It's not science.
Okay. So you would fall back on the studies as opposed to any sort of anecdotal information.
Yeah, it's it's a tough sell. There are some, I've worked with some folks around the Baytown area, around the plant there, and address some of their community complaints, and some of them did correlate with a significant event that probably did expose them, and they had coughing and respiratory illness and watery eyes and things of that nature, the things you would have expected from
Mhm.
those. And so I think there are real exposures, and often people might say, I don't know what it was. I just started coughing for no reason. It's not like they had most of the things that in the air quality issues are not detectable by your nose.
Right.
And if you're not paying any attention to the plants and you have a symptom, you don't know where it came from. And that those are more reliable in some respects, because if someone's, you know, paying too close attention to everything that goes on, like saying during the flare events, they have more symptoms. I'm not really sure. Yeah, and maybe that was a high production time. Why did they
Mhm.
know? The flares go on all the time, basically. And so I'm not sure what to do with that information,
Okay.
other than to say, yeah, it may possibly have been a big production event and you may have been exposed to something, but unless we measure it, it's very hard to tell.
Would you be willing to live next to a refinery or one of these high production areas?
Uh, Hell no. So, but and I have a lot of knowledge about it, and I know there are significant health risks. I would never raise my children in that environment either. But that goes to the environmental justice. I can afford not to, and I pay attention to the air quality. And when I left Galveston, even though Galveston, relatively speaking, had prevailing winds from the south, and we weren't as impacted by the refineries. In the winter, wind comes the other direction, and we would joke as like, Texas City's here today, and or Chocolate Bayou, or wherever the wind was coming from, and so I wouldn't even dream of being that close. And I think, you know, in a better, regulated community, that we don't have in Texas, we would have buffer zones and a lot more. And we wouldn't put low income housing right, because the land is cheap. It's obvious, and it's right adjacent to the plants in Texas City, and um, put a lot of parks and stuff. It's just, I think it's wrong. Just from what we know, it's not a good idea. And of course, when there are significant events, of explosions or, high releases from accidents, those people are at very high risk of getting exposed.
Is there anything that you would like to bring up that I missed or that we didn't discuss?
I'd like to pass on a story, in support of the EPA. And when we did our study in Galveston, we published the results. And I don't know, I had moved to San Antonio by then. So, gosh, it may be like 8, 10 years later. And I got a call from an EPA scientist. that he said they were reviewing the PM standards, the PM 2.5 standards at that time. This was under the Obama administration. And all of us in the field know the PM 2.5 standards are too high.
Can you very quickly explain PM 2.5?
Yeah, particulate matter 2.5 is measures. It's a 2.5 microns, which is less than a width of a hair, and it gets deposited in the distal airways. So that PM10 was a previous standard, and it moved to PM 2.5, and now there's also measurements of ultrafine particles. And so the difference is the very large part of the PM10 get deposited in the upper airway, the nose, et cetera, and have been shown to cause a lot of upper respiratory symptoms, whereas the PM 2.5 are germane because they get deposited in the distal airways and may trigger things like asthma, and so have a lot of pulmonary disease associated with high PM 2.5 levels.
Okay.
The ultrafine go right through the air sacs and into the bloodstream and may actually impact the heart because the blood leaves the lungs and goes directly to the heart. And composition varies, from wood fires to automobile, et cetera. And although over the years, the PM10 have reduced, but the PM 2.5 are still pretty high. And so a lot of health effects have now been ascribed to the PM 2.5. And again, it's our automobiles. That's what's producing the most of it. Okay. Now, of course, in industrial areas, so I'll just say mobile sources and industrial areas, you do have contribution of air toxics and so these particles, may be carbon black, or it may be all kinds of constituents, and because they recombine and reform in the atmosphere. Okay. So we had found the major health effect in those lifeguards, and so the scientist asked me, he said, I was reviewing because we're reviewing the standards, and he said, I had a huge data table that my student had transcribed from all the statistics that we had done. And he said, and out of like 100 little boxes of numbers, the scientist, he says, we found a discrepancy in 3 of your areas. And I looked at, and he said, would you share us the statistics on that, or let us know if we're correct, or because it doesn't seem to make sense. And so I dug out my old data, and I found those 3 data points, and they were right. We had transcribed the wrong number over. It didn't change our overall results, but it was one of those, tiny, tiny little findings that nobody else would have ever noticed. Nobody else picked it up, noticed our mistake. And so at that point, I said, yeah. I called him back. I said, yeah, you're right. And he said, and I sent them the data, the statistical analysis. And then they called back later and said, would you mind sharing your raw data with us so we could reanalyze it? There's a lot of work. And I said, sure. And I had the big data set, and I sent it to them. It just told me how hard these guys work and how objective they are with the detail that they go about their job. None of this is political. They're just, the career scientists at EPA are tremendous. And I think they need to be supported as much as possible, because I really have a lot of respect for them. That said, they did recommend lowering the PM 2.5 standards, but politically speaking, it didn't happen because most of the major cities would have been out of compliance and would have been a major issue. No. So, well, that's just a little anecdote that I really think is great.
No, that's a great because especially here in Texas, you hear about the politicization of EPA or other environmental groups, but that's really good to show how they're more obsessed about the data than anything else.
They are. They're like me. I'm a data monger, and I don't make conclusions unless the data points to it, right. And regardless of what my biases might be.
So there's been San Antonio, and I believe Dallas and Houston that are up for non-attainment right now. Right. Can you tell me what that's about a little bit? Tell me what does non-attainment actually mean, and why is San Antonio, since that's where you based, in non-attainment? Right.
Well, I mean, it's the regulations focused on the criteria pollutants, ozone, SO2, NO2, in particulates, and it means they're too high. And
Okay.
yeah, they've slowly been lowering the standards over the years, particularly ozone. And we have to think of these things as, I know everyone thought, oh, the ozone's not that bad. It's sort of, if you will, it's sort of an indicator pollutant, like carbon monoxide, is associated with other co-pollutants. And so it's sort of a all of the above, because to have ozone, you need a certain formula, to produce the ozone, and it is very toxic and irritating to the airways. And that simply means that they are not hitting they're going higher than the standard, than the EPA. It's all based on the Clean Air Act and the standards that have been set by EPA. And they have to come up with an implementation plan on how they're going to reduce that. And, I sat on the ozone SIP, the state implementation plan stakeholders group 20 years ago in Houston. And everything's up, for discussion, whether it's mobile sources and refineries, et cetera. And when they did the Texas Air Quality Study in 2000, it pretty much proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that the majority of the ozone problem in Houston was coming from the highly reactive VOCs in the petrochemical industry. And so you get these plumes of high, and whether they hit the monitoring site or not, because of meteorology, because they're coming in these sort of little bombs and they'll drop down. There's a certain area of Houston called the Aldine area that it seemed to drop down on. And ironically, you said, well, did I ever live near a petrochemical plant? And I said, no. However, it turns out I'm living in the area of San Antonio that has the highest ozone problem. And the reason for that is geography and meteorology. Again, the prevailing winds in the summers come from the south, from the ocean, and they hit up against the hill country and it stops. So you get a relative inversion there. So the highest, the monitor with the highest readings is not far from my house. And that's not something I looked into. And, so again, that's it. That's it. Living next to a plant is emotional. You see it, you smell it, etc. And this is invisible. I'm out in the hill country. It's beautiful. There's deer running around, and yet we happen to have the highest ozone levels. San Antonio, like all cities, have really, there's very little citywide, sort of restrictions, so like in California where you have the little things to prevent the VOCs coming from your gas tank and et cetera. There's no tailpipe testing, et cetera. And so I don't, I haven't been involved in that political process, how you convince the state regulators or the EPA, but nothing much seems to happen over the years. I can tell you I've been sort of watching this topic my whole career, and other than in refineries, I think those make a big difference when they put in technological solutions, scavenging systems, etc. It makes a difference. I think going back to your original topic with the oil field operations, putting restrictions in and scavenging systems or whatever, some technological solution to the release of the hydrogen sulfide gas, I think needs to be. That hasn't been done. It's still sort of it's out in the middle of nowhere. It's not a big deal. That's always the argument, right? But as an occupational hazard, the oil workers, make good money, but they're sacrificing to some degree their health.
Okay. The legislative response and some of the regulatory response to non-attainment has been, well, EPA only has 3 monitors in Texas, and we know it's all coming from Mexico anyway. Do those arguments hold any weight?
No.
Okay.
In modeling, yeah. You have to account for other sources, but the transport of most pollutants, by the time they came from Mexico, they're degraded. They're gone.
Okay.
So they react in the atmosphere. Particulates, like when they burn the fields in Mexico. And I recall I got interviewed. I don't know if you recall. When there was one year when they were burning the fields in Mexico, and we had a whole lot of Mexican smoke coming
Yeah.
across the border and into Texas. And so I was looking at the data and, looking at the fine particulate levels that people were experiencing. And when they interviewed me, they had a biologist they were interviewing, and because I watched it later on the Discovery Channel, and it was the worst disaster we've ever experienced with all the blah blah blah. And they asked me, and I said, well, it's like a bad day in Houston.